Okay, welcome again, everyone. This is our 13th class. We just had the quiz, and I'm going to go over the quiz next week. You're back. The test will be on, as you said, it will be on the 15th in our normal class session. The test will have 3 parts. The first part will be kind of mostly kind of, basically if you followed the quizzes, it'll be the same other kind of things. There will be 3 parts. The first part will be block questions, questions that you have to put answers in, okay? You just have to put the answers in. There'll be some kind of a question will have a certain kind of form with 2 blocks to text. You put block to text in, and then you just put the answer in to fill the question of the blocks. Just follow the instructions that's on it. And each thing is worth, each question is worth a point. So some things will have a thing will have 3 questions to it, or 3 possible points to it. It'll say, listen, of this, fill these blanks in, right? And then each one of the answers is a point. So every answer there is a point, and that kind of thing. And likewise, in part three will often have matching and things like that, like matching and similar kind of things. Okay, so therefore you either have to match things or you have to circle things, and therefore that is the way that those kind of questions are designed. So there's first part. I think it's mostly fill in the blank, a block, a kind of box. You put an answer into it. Just say, what are the, point 1, 2, 3, answer. Second part is true false. There's this whole series of true false. I think there's about 30 something points, 30, 40 points true false, and then the remaining. So I think it's like I think everything together is 100 points. So I think it's part 1 has around 30 something points, part 2 has 40 something, and the last has 20. So it's about, it just reeks 100 points on the face of it. Also remember, those of you who wish to do the extra credit assignment that I gave out a couple weeks ago, it is if you're going to do it, please submit it by the date on the system. Okay, remember, right? There's a box. I think I put a box in the system, right? A drop box. So there's a record of it. So just if you're going to do it, please do it on the deadline. It's on the day of the exam, but it has a little later deadline. So if you do it earlier or later, it really shouldn't be done any day later than that. Okay. So I put and that's it. That's the extra credit for the exam. The extra credit will count. There's 3 possible ways I will use the extra credit. Okay, if you need help on the bonus at the quizzes, if your quiz is a little low because the averages or you missed one or something like this, I can add the points extra. I can add the bonus points there. Or I also can add the bonus points. There's 2 ways. One is I can I will bump some of them into the quizzes. The other bonus thing is I bump it over to the overall average. In other words, what I will do is I will reduce the points in half. If I do it that way, the points and things will be cut in half, and I'll use it to boost up your average. And I will do it the way that works best. Okay? In other words, if it would be better for me to boost your average to help you, then I will do that. If it would be better to simply add it to the things, whatever is the most advantageous. Okay, that's the rule for that. So therefore, there will be some benefit to it. It's optional. You do need, in other words, you just can't submit everything. You won't be punished for it, but you won't get any credit for a piece of crap, okay? You need to, if it's so-so, you'll get some credit. If it's decent, you get more credit. If it's good, you get, in other words, again, the amount of extra credit you get will vary on the quality of the product, okay? So therefore, this is not simply just free, but it does require. But it's still an open gift for you. And I said, this is also designed so that you can do something in your writing course. I don't think any of you are actually having assignments in other courses, right? Writing assignments?
We do.
Oh, because usually they don't have writing assignments, like essay assignments in these first year courses, but some teachers are doing that. Oh boy, bad teachers. Because usually they don't like doing that. I gave it just so that you get an extra credit, so that maybe to make something fun to do in the writing course. Because you have to do a writing project for your writing thing, right? And therefore, therefore this is something that you've been spending time on and know something about. Should make it a little easier to do it, okay? So in that sense. Okay, today, it's our 13th session. The topic today in decision making, remember the thing when we talked about communication? You know, we looked at that block from last week about this is kind of what in a given society, right? In the structure of the regime, the ruling part of the regime of government, and the society at large, right? All the forces of information, communication, interaction, okay? This is the chaos of life, okay? Of the nature of information, the nature of decisions, policy actions, whatever. Now, the goal of effective political rule or statecraft is bringing order and effectiveness to this chaotic environment. In other words, the purpose of statecraft and the purpose of good political rule is that you're trying to take this chaos, take this the whole actions of what's going on in the system, and make it try to give it some order. A general purpose and general order that makes it effective and efficient. Now, one of the things we do is we have to talk about is decision making. And decision making is one of the key factors in statecraft. Now, decision making happens at many levels. It can happen at we think of state decision making, we think of, it happens at a legislative level, at lawmakers of what laws to make, what policies to do, whether to adopt it or whether to frame it, right? So the lawmaking and legislative aspect of decision making. There's also the executive level of decision making, of what that is the function of which policy action to implement and how to implement it best, and which, in other words, and then lastly, the decision making regarding judicial decision making. The different levels of between the jury making a decision about in a trial, either a criminal trial or civil suit, the role of judges making decisions about what evidence to be admitted and what evidence not to be admitted, what should be included, what should not be included, the rules of evidence, rules of procedure, judicial acts of judges at the appellate level, reviewing cases to make sure things are done properly or ensure that things are done properly. And then last means this is the question of here. So therefore, decisions are this sense of what we're doing now. What is at the core of these political actors to make the choices that they do? In other words, what is the core of what makes it? In other words, you have to understand why decision makers do what they do and how they do it. Now, the many reasons is because of the goals. In other words, we have the thing that, like we said, the tools were the things we talked about last week, right? The tools and instruments of statecraft or politics were what we talked about last week, the eight different things, right? Administration, law, education, culture, economics, diplomacy, force. And these are the tools. Okay. When you're acting, you use tools, but why are you using tools? What is the tool? Why are you the purpose of using the tool? Which tool should you use? This is an aspect of decision. The decision is, what are you trying to do? Right? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? Who's the target? What? Well, I mean, that's not necessarily audience. Audience is aspect of rhetoric. Audience is the rhetoric, but target, I mean, you have to understand who's really the group you're trying to target. Who's the thing? What's going on? I mean, what is the policy you're trying to do? What is the effect you're trying to get? What is the effect you're trying to get, or change you're trying to make? And who's going to benefit? And does the benefit and the benefit that comes out of the process, does it stabilize or destabilize your rule or the harmonious aspect of your administration? You can pursue a policy, right, that benefits people, but then what happens is what? The benefit creates this, in other words, as those groups, that this group benefits, this creates an instability in the system. Okay? And you have to remember one of the biggest problems in political, when a public policy or a political entity, when it should happen, what happens is it should benefit the community as a whole. This is usually this is what we consider fair or equitable distribution of a policy effect. In other words, public policy should have and usually in democratic or at least meritocratic political regimes. Like you can have even aristocratic, and you can even have some monarchic or even oligarchic regimes that do nevertheless rule that their rule is benefiting the wider society, okay? So the idea, the good political rule and actions should benefit the wider society, not just simply segments within the society, okay? But you're never going to escape the reality that not everyone is going to benefit. Not every segment of society is going to benefit equally in any change. In other words, ideally, political action should benefit all. But the reality is that not everyone is going to get the same level of benefit from a policy that generally, in other words, you can have two methods, but I can specifically target toward an audience, or I can have a general policy, right? A general effect. Okay, a general effect will not always lead to everyone getting the same benefit. In other words, the law itself does not intentionally benefit one group over another, but certain groups will tend to benefit over others. And it may not be, and the reason may be completely arbitrary, accidental. Sometimes it could be structural between those groups who have been there longer, but then other things it could be those. In other words, the who benefits and why they benefits can vary to significant degrees. Okay, but the reality is that there's not always going to be equal general benefit. Some groups are probably going to benefit more, but everyone will benefit to some degree. At least, usually, no one should be harmed greatly. No one specific group should have their interest harmed. In fact, that's what one of the problems is. One of the problems in a policy that actually produces harm to specific groups, this creates a problem. Okay? In other words, and actually remember the law of unintended, you have to remember this, the law of unintended consequences. That sometimes you pursue a policy that you think is going to produce benefits. It can ultimately backfire. The example of this is much of welfare policy. Much of welfare policy in the 20th century backfired. the war on poverty produced more poverty, not less. The war on illegitimate children, the illegitimacy, trying to fight illegitimacy, because that was one of the things. One of the things of the early policy formulations of why were such high levels of poverty in rural and urban areas? And they said, okay, illegitimacy. So what we need to do is we need to fight illegitimacy. So what happened? What happened to the illegitimacy rates starting in the 1970s and 80s and 90s?
Probably rose up.
It's drastically rose up. What used to be only a minority, okay, in the African American community in the United States, illegitimacy late in the 1930s and 40s we're about in the 30%. And the poor, very poor white population had about 26, 25, okay? But the white middle class had less than, the white professional middle class mostly had less than 2%, 3% illegitimacy, okay? And the elites, the higher upper class, had likewise. In other words, the lower middle class, upper middle class, and higher class had very low illegitimacy rates before the 1960s. What happened to illegitimacy in the middle class by the 1980s and 1990s, and now? First, by the 1970s and 80s, the 30% African weight in African American and poor populations went from the African American population was in 30s to 35s. Poor white America was 25, slightly lower. What happened by the mid 1980s, 1980s? It went up to 60%, sometimes 70%. By the 1990s, the white middle class, lower middle class, and middle class, okay, the lower middle class had less than 10%, less than 5 or 10. Like, I think you cross the board in the 50s and 60s. The white lower middle class often had about, they may have had 5 or 6%, 7% some years, but still lower, okay? It was nothing above 10. And the middle class, and upper middle class, and upper classes had nothing like maybe 2, 3% at most. Okay? So what happens to the middle class groups by the 1990s? They're in the 40%. Okay? And what happened to the upper class? 10%. The very rich, there is a slight increase, but not a huge increase. But for every other social group, there was huge increases. Okay? So what happened? All of a sudden, you had people who should never have been integrated into situations of, okay, there is a correlation between single parenthood and poverty. Single-parent families tend to have higher rates of not being able to earn enough income, even if they have good education, even if they come from better families. In other words, that this criteria creates a problem, and therefore this leads to the likelihood of having what we call having financial situations and problems that will and for child care, child development, and other issues. Okay. So poverty, long-term economic risk of poverty. So the government spent billions of dollars in this time frame, and not much changed. In fact, it got worse. The more they did, the worse it got. And that's because human social interaction is far more complicated. If we're doing a course on poverty, we'll say we looked at the rationality of this. You have to remember that the rational act, in other words, the problem is that the actors in question are not necessarily good. In other words, you have a policy which empowers and liberates young people. The second they get, in other words, the women's rights and the rights and the attempt to limit parental control of children led to the granting of autonomy and independence to younger women, ended up creating a situation where you could no longer rely on parental control or parental manipulation and actually parental coercion to force younger women to either adopt, or give away, or hide their pregnancy, which was the standard practice. And then government intervention policies offered a chance of liberation. Now the problem with this is, what looks liberating to a 16-year-old is not necessarily logical for their, in other words, the liberation that a free apartment and money and lack of control of mommy and daddy is an incentive that is more attractive to a 16-year-old than it would be to a 20, 30-year-old, right? So therefore, you have different cost-benefit relation models. So everyone's, in other words, the policymaker is not assuming that the 18-year-old and 16-year-old is going to think that doing this is beneficial to them. But from the perspective of an 18-year-old, this may be, in their mind, a benefit, that they're able to have more freedom, more autonomy from mom and dad, to be able to see Johnny when they want to, have their own apartment and freedom. Because why? Often people don't always take into consideration long-term consequences of choices. So that's one of the problems. Human actors don't always look at long-term consequences. They look at short-term consequences, and because of that, the long-term effect of policy can be, I produce a policy that does it. It doesn't produce the, I'm thinking that, okay, rational actors are, I'm going to have all this money to deal with the people who are going to happen. But all of a sudden now, I've created an incentive straight model by which immature decision makers are now going to see a cost benefit to engage in the activity that they didn't have before, particularly when social cultural restraints are lifted. As parental control and individual autonomy was granted, increasingly the legal system would not allow parents to curtail the choice of children. Okay? And that the fact that once a teenage girl went to an agency to get help, the parents often were removed from the process of ability to influence or to affect the decision. Once social workers got involved, parental control was severed in the courts. So therefore, this is why the structure of what happens is the thing. So therefore, this is why we have to understand that this is why the decision making and policy process don't always end up doing the results that they want to do. Decision making is also the question of ends and means. What are the ends are the goals or desired things you want. The means are the tools that achieve by which of these goals and desires and set of results will be achieved by. These are the means by which those policies or results you want are going to be achieved by. Again, this is another thing. Ends are determined and decided by the given political process, the reality of each regime. In other words, the goals that are set, the regime, the political system in question will set the goals, achieve what the goals are. I mean, I'll give you an example. Let's say, think of 500 plus. 500 plus was a specific goal by the policy, was designed to increase, in other words, change the demographic situation of the long-term propriety of Poland, but also to change the political environment, to create, to basically direct not significant, but enough money to lower middle-class families that would improve their weekly, monthly quality of life, thus changing the political environment. In other words, changing the effects of the economy against the lower middle classes. In other words, the economic policy was directly aimed at the lower and middle classes. The lower and lower middle classes. But at the same time, it rewarded healthy families, i.e., families that stayed together versus families that broke apart. In other words, it wasn't going to, this is an example of a policy that is not a perverse policy. It isn't really generating the perverse incentives that other social welfare policies tended to. In fact, this is one of the criticisms many people on the left are criticizing the 500 plus program for, because it's saying, oh, single mothers are not getting the best advantage of this. Okay? Well, that's perfect in this plan, because why? Because they don't want a lot of new single mothers. They want to disincentivize single motherhood. You understand? Because the argument is single motherhood leads to greater poverty, not less. And the goal here is not to create a dependent class, but what? To empower the lower classes out of a certain level of poverty. Out of this, not poverty, but out of a certain level of economic necessity. That to be able to hire daycare. They can pay grandma to stay and take care of the kids, while the wife gets another job. In other words, mechanisms, 500 plus gives mechanisms of money to empower these lower middle class families to earn more money and to be able to buy houses, afford lifestyles, okay? Therefore, what does this do? The benefit of this is twofold. Politically, it means PIS, get a new voter base. Come on, you don't think all political action policies, every policy is achieved this, to achieve some benefit for the political. So there's two goals, the real benefit and the political benefit of a goal. Now this is the other aspect of this, as well as who are making decisions in that regime. Okay, this is the ends and goals. In other words, the regime itself and the people who are making decisions determine the goals. Now the question is, there's two types of goals. There are long-term goals, and then there are short-term goals. Long-term goals usually called strategy. Okay? A short-term goal is day-to-day political life. That ad-live life, L-I-F-E, a necessity of keeping power and keeping control. Okay? There's two ways of doing it. If you're only responding to short-term things, then you're always hands-on, always changing reaction. Strategy, long-term strategy, gives you a situation where you what? Set goals and you don't have to micromanage as much. You set goals and you only respond to correct for when things aren't going the way they should be going. But if you're only doing day-by-day policy and looking at the daily needs, and you're only doing short-term goals, right, or immediate goals, then what happens? Well, then you're always having to decide. You can never, long-term benefit is accidental, not intentional. Another aspect, strategy will involve long-term applications of various tools that are directed towards various targets for the ranges of desired outcomes. In other words, strategy will not only determine the goals, but it will also determine, well, it will determine what has to be done, and therefore what has to be done will determine what tools you use to best achieve those goals. Ends and means. Ends and means are fundamentally connected. Means should never dictate ends. That's bad policymaking. Goals should always dictate means. The goals and how to best achieve them will determine the means you use to get those ends. That's a correct policy, always. But ends and means are fundamentally connected. Therefore, organization and collective bodies, right? In other words, we need to distinguish between the goals and motivations of two things. Organizations and collective bodies, and the individual leaders and decision makers. There's an understanding of there's an organizational or collective body. Remember, the state itself, or a government entity, a voivode, a political unit, an institution, all these are collective bodies. But in those collective bodies, there's going to be actors who have individual actors that have very specific key decision making. In Parliament, right, the same, you have the same, a collective body, but you also have every member of the same who makes a decision. So the concept of collective decision making. Where individual decision maker, we can try to understand the motivation of the individual decision maker, but to understand the collective, you have to approach it differently. You have to approach it not in terms, and there's no way to accurately get the collective mind. You have to only understand it statistically. You can only understand, in other words, this is the difference. When you're trying to understand collective bodies, aggregate bodies, then statistics and demographic information is useful. You can make general statements of this. But for individual behavior, this is where the problem comes up. This is why you turn to psychology. Applying psychology demographically might be a problem. Because why? Because psychology tends to address an aspect at the specific level of the specific actor. And you shouldn't generalize from the specific to the general. Whereas large group data, you're examining the phenomena of a large group, and therefore you can sort the groups up, and therefore sort the behavior of groups. So therefore, this is why demographic data is useful to understanding groups, but you shouldn't. But when looking at individual actors, you should pay more attention to the psychology and character of the individual actors. So therefore, the emphasis should be here at this organization. This will say, of course, we can look at things like demographics or statistical behavior. Here, we would look at the role of psychology and the role of character. What is the key needed skills and abilities needed by leaders, right? These are the big three. Judgment, vision, nerve. This is from Lord. Judgment. Judgment makes the ability to make judgments of what is right and what course of action you should take. The classics call this prudence. What is prudence? It's the ability to know what is correct or valid thing or action to take at the right time and the right amount and to perfectly execute or carry out the right action. Okay? The prudential actor, prudence is knowing the action of what you have to do, whatever action. The prudence is the ability to know what is the correct thing to do. Not only what is the correct, but know how to do it. And how to do it correctly. It is to know which choice to make and also how to execute that choice in the environment and in the situation in the way that best allows you to implement it. Again, this is why I would use the sports analogy. Prudence is like the perfect athlete playing the perfect game. When the perfect athlete, an athlete executing the game perfectly, he is, in other words, it's not this, this is his ability to know if I do this to that and shoot the ball at this way, and knowing the other players, what they're going to do, I will be able to achieve my score, right? Well, that's that is how it works in the game. This is analogous, not identical, but analogous to how prudence actualizes. Prudence is a kind of, it's a virtue, it's one of the excellences, but it's an intellectual excellence. It is an excellence of the mind. It is the excellence of it's an excellence of its reasoning, but reasoning towards action. How to act in the world. In a world where change occurs. In a world where things are not always the same. And the ability to know what is right, or what is true, what is false, what is valid, what is invalid, what is useful, what is harmful. It is, in other words, this is a trait and skill people have. They've either developed it, you through education, through training your mind, through practicing your mind, and through learning actions, learning things, doing things. You can habituate yourself to prudence. And this is what political actors do. The political actor, by living his life and exercising his mind in action, not just merely thinking, but in acting, this is prudence. It is knowing what to do and how best to do it. Vision. It's a set of goals or clear understanding of what you want and where you want your people or group to be or to have and enjoy. Good leadership not only needs to have it, but communicate to people so they can embrace the vision as well. And in the process, it creates your support in the society as well. Vision. In other words, what is vision? It's having in your mind the goals you want to achieve. And communicating that to others in the society so that they embrace it and therefore they will support your position of doing it. Okay? Last, nerve. What is nerve? Willpower, consistency, persistence, lack of fear, or reservation to act, or resistance to pressure from various forces, inside or outside the political system or society. It is the ability not to cave to pressure and act on what you've decided. In other words, nerve is important. In other words, if you don't have nerve, all of a sudden you doubt yourself. You constantly doubt your decision making, right? That's disaster. Political leaders who constantly question their actions and their decisions or choices. If you're constantly questioning your choices, you're not going to have nerve to execute it. You're going to hesitate. Or and the biggest mistake often, once you do something, you change your mind and you stop it. Okay? You cower it out. Why? Because once you make a policy change, and you've set aside the rules to do it, but then you don't complete the new rules completely, it doesn't revert back to the old system because you've changed the old system a little bit. You've destroyed the old system, the old policies, but you made a half-hearted reform. So what's going to happen? A new outcome path, and it may not be as good as the old path. This is what happened in Poland. This is what really went wrong after transition in 1991, when they did the Basarovich plan was stopped halfway through. They only did the financial sector. The financial sector was modernized, and the monetary system, the stock system, and the financial side was reformed. But the wider economy and the labor sector wasn't reformed. But some changes were made. So therefore, what happened? The Polish economy was on a decline. This is one thing that forced the revolution in 1989, right? The communist system wasn't able to produce, they had a declining result, they had a long-term decline growth. And the reforms were attempted to fix it. But what happened? Within a year of the reforms, the political pressure from the labor sector was strong enough to stop the reform. So the labor markets didn't get reformed. So what happened? Well, you had a situation where the new trend line was below the old trend line. And particularly, not in the trend line, where it was in 1990s, early 90s, 89, 90. Because people don't recognize that the trend line was going to keep on going down. They just remember that point here. And then what happens is, all of a sudden, the new trend line was below what was in the early 90s for a decade. Only in 2005, 2006, did the new trend line of this perverted the botched transition finally get to the point where it was above the expectations of the the memories of expectations of PRL Poland in 1989, 1988. And that explains why there was such political chaos in those years. Why, starting in the mid-90s, there was all this very much chaos that favored post-communist parties. SLD and that stuff. After 2010, SLD became no longer viable. Because at this point, once inside the EU, once inside the European Union, and once the certain market started benefiting from the economic interaction in the European market completely, particularly the agricultural sector, parties like Self-Defense and even SLD had very little chance politically anymore. Okay, you see how that works in that sense? So therefore, you have to be careful. Nerve. The failure of Nerve created an economic problem, and that created a decade-long problem. Hesitating. Crisis management versus normal operations. Normal operations is the actor will follow in the process. The way, given the regime, this makes decisions are made. Given the day-to-day acting out of expected events one experiences typically for that regime. So therefore, day-to-day, it's the normal, typical set of events, given the regime and given the expectations and the forces in the regime. Crisis is when the normal is not occurring. Crisis is an expectation, exemption from to the norm or to the expected. Crisis is responding to something that is unexpected or not planned for, or because it was either unforeseen or not thought of to be relevant, or something that requires being addressed or acted on. And something that is required to be, this thing that is unforeseen requires to be addressed and acted on. The threat or challenge of the unforeseen or the unplanned for event cannot be avoided without huge negative costs to the leader or to the state, the political body. In other words, if you confronted with an unforeseen challenge or problem and you don't address it, it has huge negative costs, both either to the leader or to the political party, the political ruler, the system itself. Why judgment, visions, and nerves so important? Okay, why is it so important? Why are these virtues so important to have? Leaders who lack judgment, vision, or nerve, ordinary problems balloon easily into crises that force crisis management rather than normal day-to-day political operations. In other words, if the leaders lack judgment, lack vision, and lack nerve, then what will happen is ordinary problems become crises and cannot be managed properly. Crisis management is different from ordinary procedures. Crisis management is that you must do it. Ordinary processes, you can be laid back, you can delay, you don't have to rush decisions, you can do it, you can maybe take half measures. Don't necessarily. Crisis often requires you to act now and often act decisively and act often immediately, decisively, and with full effect. No time, no patience. So therefore, it limits the possibility of scope of action. Choices are in crisis. The choices you often have are much limited than in normal operations. In normal times, you can experiment. You can test things. Crisis, you're not able to do this. Crisis management, thus, is crises are constituted by the perception of political leaders. Perceptions of both objective threats and more or less subjective set of national or personal values and goals. In other words, what is a crisis is a subjective thing, not on the perception of not only political leaders regarding what objective threats, but also the subjective things of what? Either national or personal values or goals. That all of a sudden a crisis of values happen, or a crisis of goals. This might create a crisis. If the values of the society change to a great degree, and the leaders see this change as a threat to the ability of the system to maintain itself, this is a crisis. The original meaning of crisis from the classical is judgment and decision. The word crisis in Greek literally means judgment or decision. It is a defining moment. What distinguishes a crisis mode of policymaking is the need for rapid judgment and decision by political leaders. Crisis can afford or give political actors and leaders opportunities and occasions they normally do not have access to. They don't necessarily have. In other words, even though crisis is dangerous, crisis often is an opportunity. It offers opportunity and occasions to act that you would be, in other words, in normal times, you would not be permitted to do. Crisis offers you opportunities that in normal times most people would think is too risky. But now, the cost of the crisis, or the fear of the crisis, permits actions that were too costly in the other time, or seen as too drastic in the other times, normal times. Advice and decision. Okay, this is again typo. Oh no! Why did okay? I hate sometimes the autocorrect. Decisions often require political actors engaged to seek advice from experts and more knowledgeable in the situation. And here, this is the rise of modern bureaucracy, brings in the institutionalized expert or specialized knowledge necessary for the functioning of the principal decision maker. What is this purpose here? The purpose here is where such decisions making, twofold effect. One, with such decision making occurs, it will depend on the particular of the given regime. In other words, when this occurs, each regime will bring this decision making at a different time. So the specificity of the regime will lead to different ways of how decision making will occur. Two, one of the key or classics problems, especially in democratic regime, is who really should be making the decision? The properly elected official or the expert? Okay? Should the expert be making the decision, or should the elected politician make the decision? See, this is the crisis. Who elected the expert? Nobody. In fact, the rule of experts is anti-democratic. It's oligarchic in character. It's autocratic, aristocratic in character. It's monarchical, in fact. It has a tendency towards monarchy. The rule of the expert leads to kind of a monarchical principle sometimes. Remember we said that wisdom, the rule of wisdom, the claim of wisdom is the claim of kingship, the ancients argued. So the rule of the expert will have a monarchical cast towards it. Whereas the rule of democracy is equality. So everyone's, therefore, the elected opinion, the person we elected to office, he's the representative, he's the person, he or she is the person who we've elected to make this decision, therefore they should decide, okay? In other words, again, we've chosen this person. This person we don't choose, he's self-selected because of his knowledge. See the problem here? This is the democratic accountability problem of bureaucracy and knowledge systems. Now, Machiavelli also has a wonderful thing in his Prince on Secretaries. He says that there's three types of minds. The one that knows on its own, the one that can know from what others inform it, and then the one who cannot know either on their own or through others. The third is horrible. The first is most excellent. The second is okay, you can do it, but you're dependent on the smarty pants. And in other words, you have to listen to it. You have to make sure. The second one, you better make sure the people who you're listening to are smarter than you, really know. But what's the problem with that? If you don't know, how do you know? In other words, if you don't know, then so therefore 2 becomes 3. And the only way 2 doesn't become 3 is you're lucky because the people who are advising you really know. You're relying on chance or accident. If you're lucky and the advisors actually do know what they're talking about, then it's okay. But if you're not lucky and you got idiots advising you and you can't tell, you don't have the knowledge to discern what they're saying is idiocy, then you're just as bad as the person in the third category. So the idea that I can learn from the experts, no. You shouldn't. Rulers and deciding people should never get to the point where they should be able to judge the expert. They don't necessarily have to know everything the expert knows, but they have to be able to look at the expert and know if he's saying bullshit or not. Or is it valid or not? Okay? You have to be able to assess the things. So you have to know how to read people, know how to judge people. Therefore, you must have certain knowledge. Styles of leadership. Now he talks about the 3 classic styles. This is the classic leadership model, has 2 modes. Focus on formal decision-making process. Active and continued decision-making at every normal level of decision. Someone called this micromanaging. The other level is the more restrained form of leadership, aims at shaping of institutions and institutional cultures. Broader. In other words, I'm not going to be making decisions, I'm going to shape the larger system. And what this does, such leaders make a few key decisions over an extended period of time. They generate broader systems or processes rather than let subordinates who are closer to the problem figure the best way to carry out. So these 2 types of styles. One's a micromanaging decision-making. The decision-maker is always making the decisions. And the other one makes a broader system, set broader goals, make some key decisions that set the environment up, and then let the subordinates carry out the exercising of the day-to-day execution of things. That's the classic model. The other 2 models, consensus-making model system. The consensus model, this is kind of like, it de-emphasizes the role of individual decision makers, but stresses the overall need to get agreement of all. Here comes the flood. The sun is out and the water's breaking. All the principal actors or sectors of the regime. In other words, here's a consensus model. All the key segments or sectors of the regime must agree. If they don't agree, nothing happens. This system requires all key actors to participate in the very formation, not only of what is to be decided, but often the means are to be used and how they are to be used, and by whom, towards whom, and what. If there is no consensus, then no action may be taken by the system. Examples of this is, in many ways, this is the Israeli model, the kibbutz model in that sense. This is the model of the Japanese political system. The German system is somewhat like this because of the sectors, the 3-sector model of the German system, between the role of the economic sector, the labor sector, and the government sector, and the way that any decision makes and certain things have to meet, all 3 sectors have to agree, and if one says no, then they can block the other 2. Now the third model the Lord talks about is deliberative, and this is 3 parts again. This is similar to consensus model, but does not require the same level of total agreement, and seeks to get input and participation of not only of the principal actors within the regime, but there's also the larger society, trying to engage the larger society. And the example of this is something like the way the ratification of the Constitution, of American Constitution was done. Okay, it seeks to persuade as many as possible, although there exists a vast majority, much larger than a simple majority, supporting the decision outcome that is arrived at. So you're trying to deliberate to get a supermajority, or some larger than simple majority. And therefore, this model rewards compromise and punishes partisan striving for mere partisan gain. And then this model not only seeks to persuade those actors within the ruling body or the regime, but also larger society. In fact, especially in democratic or responsive regimes, persuading the larger part of society who can put pressure on subordinate political actors and help generate needed support to permit the enactment of policies or policy goals or actions you want. In other words, the deliberative situation allows you to bypass blocking actors and move to society and energize the society to put pressure on institutions or organizations that are being an obstacle to reform or change. So deliberative models allow, it creates in other words, it aims to treat all the segments of society, and that even though there's a blocking, it doesn't require the same level of consensus. You can create a situation where if the society is supporting you strong enough, this can put pressure on blocking institutions to do change or lose their legitimacy. Okay. Now, here we turn to what I was going to talk about a little bit for the remainder of this week and next. These chapters, the final bit of the Prince, chapters 12 to 26. If the first part of the Prince, the first 11 chapters deal with the title that originally was principalities. We did the statecraft. So therefore, I'm not going to talk about the statecraft. We talked about state already in the first couple weeks of the course. First 6 sections of the weeks of the course. So now we're going to be looking at this part. And these are chapters 12 through 14 deals with the question of arms and men. Here he deals with 12, particularly 12. He deals with the famous line about there's two things: there's arms and laws, and that in order to, that you can't have good arms without good laws. Therefore, you cannot have good arms without good laws. Therefore, he's going to. What is that line? It's a great line in that thing 12. He goes, and because there cannot be good laws where there are not good arms, and where there are good arms, there needs must be good laws, I shall omit the reasoning on laws and speak of arms. Okay? So he has this this is a very nice, subtle way of doing this. So he's going to be silent about the question of laws in the Prince. He focuses on arms. And what are arms? These are the tools and instruments to achieve what you want, particularly force. Now he has this wonderful line, then of arms, right? Then he says, what are the traditional arms? And he says, well, this is the next paragraph. He goes, I say then, this is on page 71, second paragraph. He says, I say then, that the arms which a prince defends his state are either his own, mercenary arms, auxiliary, or mixed. Okay? This is the second paragraph. So therefore, he says that there's 4 types. Your own arms, auxiliary arms, your own arms, mercenary arms, auxiliary, and mixed. Okay? Mercenary and auxiliary arms are useless and dangerous. And if one keeps his state founded on mercenary arms, he will never be at rest or secure, because those arms are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, unfaithful, valorless among friends, cowardly among enemies. They do not fear God, nor they keep faith with men. Ruin is delayed only as long as the attack is delayed. Such one is despoiled by them in peace and by enemies in war. And the cause of this is that they have no love nor any cause to keep them in the field other than that bit of coin, this bit of stipend, which is not sufficient for them to want to die for you. In other words, if you're going to have soldiers, they're going to die. They're going to want to die for you. Mercenaries don't want to die for you. They take your money. They'll take your money, but when the fighting comes, they run away or they betray you. You got to have people who love you, who care for you, who think that, in other words, you have to have friends. You have to be people who they have to be your arms. They have to be totally yours. And they're not doing it for money. In other words, this is this great line about friends. You make friends. You make friends from virtue. You don't buy friends. But you need friends when? Because the day comes, you need to spend them. You need them to do things for you. A person without friends is a person who is defenseless. So you make friends. Why? So when the day comes when you need them to spend them, you have them. So this is the most important aspect of here. The question in Machiavelli here is why? What is the problem with mercenary arms? Mercenary arms are people who you hire them. But these people are just only in for one reason. They're in for the money. People don't die for money. They'll take your money, but when it comes time to dying, they bye-bye, switch sides, run away. But this is the funny thing in the Russian militia, the Wagner groups, right? When the Wagner groups are fighting defenseless people and they're easy to slaughter, they stay and fight. The second they got any real resistance, the mercenary units broke and ran away.
That's what happened in, I don't remember the place, but they fought like American unit in somewhere in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it was 320 American soldiers, and those 300 or either run away.
It was 2,500 Russian, these Wagner group things, about 100 and less than 120, maybe 90 U.S. soldiers, a ranger unit, and the ranger unit slaughtered them. They all ran away. And they after it was 3.5 hours of fighting, that's the thing about this. Once you have, why do Americans? You have to understand American soldiers. The American soldier is a weird thing. He's usually from the rural America, rural classes, who do it because they don't like foreigners. They hate foreigners. They want to be home. They're only there, why? Because Uncle Sam sent them there and they're going to be there to kill the enemies. Okay? In other words, soldiers are, any moron who sends soldiers, American soldiers soldiers should not be used for peacekeeping. Even though they are, because they're the people that most people trust. The real purpose of soldiers it's a blunt force trauma. You want something, you need to make a point, and you need to make it hurt. You send us things like that in. That's arms. Arms, the problem here is what kind of arms you have. If you don't have arms, you have to rely on other people's arms, you're fucked. Look at Tony Blair. What happened to Tony Blair in 1990s? Tony Blair destroyed during the end of the Major era and during the beginning, most of the reign of Blair's new Labour government. What the English did to the British military was cut its budget by 10-15% yearly. So the English and British military by the 1990s and early thousands was nothing like it was in the 1980s. It was 1/10 of what it was in the 1980s. And no one, in other words, nobody entered the old professional classes, the old elites were blocked out of the military. And now what happened, there became more democratic, society-based people put in officers, and therefore the quality of the officer corps changed. It became more democratic and more diverse, and therefore the old classes who used to go into the military didn't, and therefore the army changed. Okay? So what happens? You have an army that can't fight, an army that's under-equipped. So what do? You have to rely on American soldiers. In other words, Blair's foreign policy in Kosovo. You have to remember, Blair brought us George Bush W. Jr. was an idiot, okay? He was a drunk, an alcoholic, drug user who was so blown. In other words, his drug abuse in his 20s blew his mind. And if you ever met a druggie that you can tell them they're burnt out, okay? He was a good governor. He was successful in that sense, and he was able to win the presidency because his policy. It was a backlash against the Clinton years. Okay, and remember, his policy was not aggressive. His original policy was to ignore no nation building, and he ran in 2000 against nation building, against Clinton's foreign policies agenda. And then what else? So building our ignore Europe and spend more time building Latin American relationships. Remember, the first country Bush visited as president was Mexico. Okay. Then 9/11 happened, and what? Who became George Bush's best friend? Tony Blair. It was Tony Blair who pushed WMD. Tony Blair perfectly relied on the British for this century, and right now the Blair administration relied on American power to achieve his agenda. And what is that? Allies, auxiliary forces. Auxiliary forces are your allies. The danger of auxiliary forces are what? You gotta hope they're run by idiots. If they're run by idiots, they do what you want. But if they're not run by idiots, what happens? Well, if they win, and you don't get anything. And if you lose, and they leave you alone with the bill. Okay. Auxiliary forces are all the risk is yours, all the benefit is theirs. Mercenary arms are completely untrustworthy. So mixed arms are what? Combinations of things. Now, why does he do this? He talks about Rome. The Rome and Sparta are the perfect examples. This is on page 73. Rome, Sparta, for centuries were armed and free. First paragraph there. The Swiss are armed to the highest degree and free to the highest degree. The Carthaginians are an example of ancient mercenary arms, and they were oppressed by the mercenary soldiers. And when the first war with the Romans ended, even though the Carthaginians had their own citizens as leaders, after the death of Euripides and Philip of Macedon was made captain of the people of Thebes, and after he won victories, he took away their liberty. The Maltese hired Francisco Sforza against the Venetians after Duke Filippo died. After overcoming their enemies at Coggiario, he joined with them in order to oppress his patrons, the Milanese. Remember, Milan is run by the Scorsese. Scorza, his father, having been hired by Queen Giovanni of Naples, then left her in one stroke, disarmed, whereupon, to save the kingdom, she was constrained to throw herself in the lap of King of Aragon. Nice sex symbol for it. In other words, she had to marry the king of the... And if the Venetians and the Florentines have had past increases their imperiums because of these armed mercenaries, yet their captains have not let them make themselves princes, but have indeed defended them. I respond that the Florentines in this case have been favorites of chance. For the captain, in other words, he goes on to say, he says the captains who were great, none of the captains who were great or good, skilled, won any major victories, and the one who had major victories decided to get benefits elsewhere. Okay. So therefore, he says that this is a line. And I skip over here. He goes to, this is the end of the militias again, chapter 12. This is the 9th paragraph at page 75. The order which they have kept has been first to take away the reputation of infantry, to gain the reputation for themselves. They did this because, being men without a state and dependent on their own industry, they were unable to feed many, and a few infantry could not give them a reputation. They therefore reduced to horse, and were supported a number of these, they could feed themselves and gain honors. They were therefore reduced to such terms that an army of 20,000 soldiers could not be found in 2,000, and could not find, in other words, an army of 20,000, one could not find 2,000 infantry. Besides this, they used all their industry to free themselves and their soldiers from toil and fear. They did not kill themselves in skirmishes, but took each other prisoners without ransom. They did not attack towns at night, nor did the towns attack the tents. They constructed neither stockades nor trenches around their camps. They did not campaign in winter. And all these things were permitted by their military orders, which were founded by them to avoid, as has been said, toils and danger. So the point here is that the question of arms, he gets that mercenary arms are bad. And then he continues this. In other words, auxiliary arms. This is to be relying on fortune. Now he has many examples of here allies. What's important here is that Julius, the example of Pope Julius II. Julius II wholly relied on his military success because of why? He was relying, auxiliary arms. He was relying on the Spains. In fact, but however, he's successful not because it's not, his big success happened when he lost. The French defeated the Spanish. You thought he would have lost, right? But no, because the French king didn't pay the Swiss soldiers, the Swiss mercenaries. The Swiss mercenaries switched sides, and Julius paid them, and therefore Julius won. In other words, the French army, because the success of the French was the French army with the Swiss infantry. French horse and artillery with Swiss infantry. The French were nothing without the Swiss. So when the Swiss switched sides, what happened? The French ran away. Even though the French and Swiss defeated the Spanish and his major ally, he should have lost. But because the French king didn't pay his Swiss mercenaries and he had gold, he bought their loyalty. And then the French had to flee. So that's he gives that example there. Now the other example of arms, these examples he gives in arms, 3 chapters, 14. What should the prince do? A prince in chapter 14 is you should spend your time studying war, nothing but war. Why? And you should be doing everything. You should be riding the field. He explains it. You go out there and you think of your mind. He goes out there and says, this is on page 89, 3rd paragraph. He ought therefore never to lift his thoughts from the exercise of war. And he ought to exercise more in peace than in war, which he can do in 2 modes. One with works, actions, and the other with intellect. And for works, besides keeping his own arms well ordered and exercised, he should always be out on the chase. And by that means to accustom his body to hardships, and to also in part to learn the nature of sights, to know how mountains rise, how valleys open, how river plains, and to understand the nature of rivers and marshes, and to be and to put in this to put the greatest of care. This knowledge is useful in 2 modes. First, he learns how to knows his own country, and then he can better understand how to defend it. And then by means of his knowledge and experience of these sights, he can easily comprehend when any other site he may necessarily have to examine for the first time. For the hillocks and valleys and rivers and marshes, for example in Tuscany, have a certain similitude to those in other provinces, so that from the knowledge of a site in one province, one can easily come to the knowledge of the others. And the prince who lacks the ability lacks the first requirement of a captain. For this teaches one how to find the enemy, choose encampments, lead armies, prepare orders of battle, and siege towns to your advantage. Now you think, what do you mean? Learn the land. Learn your land first. Why? Know you to be able to defend yourself, but also what? Because land is going to be uniform. I mean, how a marsh works here, if you come across a marsh of a similar thing, you know you have the same realities. In other words, you can apply that. In other words, you can, what you learn about the terrain features, the nature of terrain features, the use and benefit, and the problems of this. This is valid in other similar terrain features. So you're now in a foreign place, but the terrain features are relatively similar to the ones you have. Therefore, you can do what you did in your own terrain features, you can do over here. So knowledge of the particulars, knowledge of the reality of the action, knowing how to act, knowing when to decide, know how to arrange things. Now, this is the idea here, the rule of a decision maker in this. And the other example is the intellect. What should you do? This is that line of, this is the paragraph 5 on page 90 of the last chapter. Of this chapter. But it is the exercise of the intellect. The prince ought to read histories and to consider them the actions of excellent men, to see how they govern themselves in wars, and to examine the causes of their virtues and losses, in order to avoid the latter and imitate the former. And above all, to do what has been done in the past by some excellent men, who have been chosen to imitate someone before him, who has been praised and glorified, and who has always kept his deeds and actions before him. As it was said that Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar, Alexander, Scorpio, Cyrus, and whoever read the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, will immediately recognize the life of Scipio, how much in chastity, affinity, affability, humanity, and liberality. Scipio conformed himself to the things of Cyrus that Xenophon had written. A wise prince ought to observe the same mode and never be lazy in peacetime, but have the industry to make capital of them, in order to have their value in adversities, so that when fortune changes, he will be easily found ready to resist them. So therefore, in other words, you learn actions and deeds, and you do the mind. You imitate the great. You imitate the best. You learn the histories of actors. This is the way the things like this. Now, chapters 15 to 20, these are the virtues. This is the famous series of virtues. What he does is he takes the classical Aristotelian virtues and he overturns them. In other words, he says that in the famous chapter 15, he starts off with the famous claim. It remains to see how modes of government a prince ought to be with respect and to his subjects and to his friends. And because I know many have written on this, I fear that I will be taken to be presumptuous by writing about it. Again, especially by my departing from the orders of others to the disputation of this matter. But since it's my intention to write a useful thing for him who understands, seems to me to be more profitable to go behind the effectual truth of the thing, and in the imagination thereof. And many have imagined republics and participates that have never been seen or known to be in truth, But because of this, such a distance between how one lives and how one should live, that he who lets go with what is done for that which one ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his self-preservation. So therefore, his point here is that he'll give a list of things of what you should do. And his argument is praise and blame, right? Why do we get blamed? Why do we get married? Well, we get blamed when we don't do things right. We get blamed when we fail. We get praised when we succeed, when we accomplish things and do great things. The problem, therefore, is the goal here is to deliver the good. Not necessarily winning, but delivering the benefits that people are going. It's not me holding power. You holding power does not always bring you praise. You holding power may be necessary. You keeping control of things may be necessary. It's not going to win you fame or glory. The only way you win fame or glory is to do great things that benefit the larger society, your people, your community, your body, politic. Now, he's very tightening about here. He goes, that in other words, there are some things that you have to, and the second, go read that second paragraph of that thing, where he talks about, he lists the virtues and vices, and he flips them. The question is, these things, these virtues and vices, he doesn't put the vices on one side and virtues on the other side. He flips them. Why? You have to know when to be good and when to be bad. Both virtues and vices are going to be necessary. It depends on the situation and the occasion. Sometimes it will be necessary to be vicious. Sometimes it will be necessary to be pious. Sometimes it's going to be keeping faith. Sometimes keeping faith is good. Sometimes keeping faith is bad. You have to know which virtue and which vice is the occasion and the situation calls for. And therefore, having judgment, prudence here, is to know which virtue or vice you need to use in the situation to achieve the goal you want to achieve. And therefore, the question of liberality and parsimonious. Liberality was the classic vice, but he says, what happened to liberality? Liberality destroys you. Being liberal means being generous. Okay, being generous means spending your money. But if you're spending your money for helping everyone, what happens? You have no money left when you need the crisis. You're broke. You're defenseless. That good? No. You should never spend your money. You should spend other people's money. Don't spend your own money. Spend other. But your people's money. Here's the other thing. You're a populace. You're a ruler, right? The people's money is your money, so don't spend their money. Because what is you talk about love and hated, right? You should you be feared or loved? That famous debate in here, right? His argument is, well, men. And it's a wonderful line about men. Men are fickle. They'll promise you a lot of things. Human beings are fickle. They'll promise you your sons, loyalty and things, but then when the day is bad, they're not there. They run away. They're mud. So you can't rely on the people. You can't rely on the others. Therefore, this is why it's very important in that case. Therefore, what's more important? Love comes and goes. Fear. Most people do. Most people will keep faith out of fear rather than love. Fear is the better strategy. But avoid being hated and despised. If you're hated and despised, then they destroy you. So be feared but not hated. And don't do anything that makes you despised. So avoid the vices and virtues that lead you to be despised. That's the whole point. Now, we'll continue this next week when we'll finish the Prudence and the Prince, chapters 20 to 25 a little bit, and then we look at the application. In other words, there he applies the virtues in the situations, testing you whether you understand the situation. There, kid. See ya.